My name is Dmitri Trenin. I'm director of the Carnegie Moscow Center. I invite you to what I think will be an exciting dialogue about the future of Indo-Russian relations. This relationship, while generally friendly and praised in both countries, has been stagnating in the past several years, despite efforts to energize it. The material base that traditionally supports the Indo-Russia relationship, arms sales and state-supported projects, has been only slowly expanding in the last couple of decades. A lot has been said and continues to be said in both countries about the need to give a new impetus to the relationship between two great powers. But the question is, what are practical ways of upgrading the economic and technological cooperation between India and Russia, and how to make their geopolitical and security ties more effective? And this comes precisely at the moment when the global system is experiencing a number of pretty serious upheavals and going through a pretty painful and in many ways fundamental transformation, with the continued confrontation between Russia and the United States, the new confrontation, formerly rivalry, now confrontation, in my view, between China and the United States, and competition and recent incidents between India and China. Where is the Indo-Russia relationship in this very unstable global situation? I welcome you, all those who've joined by Zoom, and I welcome the people who are watching us online. Those on Zoom can ask questions by raising their virtual hands or in Zoom chats. Those who are watching us on YouTube can ask questions in comments on YouTube or write to us on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is Carnegie Russia. We have an illustrious array of speakers today, but before I introduce the speakers, let me give the floor to Ambassador Venkata Varma, the ambassador of the Republic of India to Russia, who in his conversations with me was the inspirational force behind this event today. Your Excellency, Mr. Ambassador, the floor is yours, sir.
Morning to our friends in Moscow and Russia, and our friends in India, and colleagues who have joined us from different parts of the world. Absolutely delighted that Carnegie Moscow and Carnegie India are in it together, and thank you very much, Dmitri Trenin, for this event. This is the first time we are doing it. I hope we will do this as a matter of practice. One probably at the end of the year to do a review of where we stand on this particular topic. Mr. Trenin, of course, has put the gauntlet right down. He's asking a bilateral ambassador to agree to a description of the relationship that he oversees by using the extremely evocative word stagnation. Of course, I will not be the first bilateral ambassador to admit that the relationship that he oversees is one of stagnation. I would rather tend to use the word generated potential, and that is waiting to take off by changing the drivers of the bilateral relationship in a fast-changing international environment. And I think on both counts, India and Russia are uniquely placed And the word unique is, of course, derived from historic practice and experience and the changes that have taken place over several decades. So let me put a few points on the table, and I'm sure the very distinguished panel, including our dear friends from the ORF, Mr. Samir Saran and Nandan Krishnan, and colleagues from Carnegie India will be weighing in on these points. Let me stick to the TED principle of sticking to 4 points under each topic. So let me say first that there are 4 durable convergences which characterize the unique India-Russia relationship, which is accommodated change with great continuity. The first is a strategic interest of each country is in each other's growth. We rejoice in each other's strength, and this has been a tradition for several decades now. And that is also explainable by the fact that there is great geopolitical compatibility that is very unique, rare to find in international relations. That has led, of course, to a strategic trust and confidence that is quite unparalleled. It is repeated every year with every change of leadership, and it is definitely at its best form in the relationship between Prime Minister Modi and President Putin. Number 4, there is a genuine popular sentiment in both countries that drives and supports this relationship. So if these are these 4 durable convergences, what are the 4 traditional pillars of this relationship? Of course, as Dmitri has mentioned, there have been some old pillars. Defense, energy, nuclear, and space have done exceedingly well, are poised to do even better in the future. But of course, we need to renew this relationship. We need to find new drivers. And in my view, there are 4 new drivers that we can look at. One is the agro industry. This is a new opportunity. Russia has emerged in the last few years as an agricultural superpower. Its agricultural exports are booming. Russia today is now very much like the Russia 100 years ago, when there was great agricultural vitality in the country. The COVID pandemic has shone light on the great potential that is there in India as the pharmacy of the world, and the great technological potential and the organizational capabilities in Russia. So pharma and health sector is the second pillar. Digital and IT, this is a vastly unexplored potential that both Indian and Russian industry can get together and see and look at the new opportunities. Of course, these have come into greater focus during the COVID pandemic. For migration, Russia, and I'm very confident that these 4 tendencies can be accommodated in a manner that will benefit both countries. What are the 4 new instruments that we should be looking at? I think regional issues, there's great regional potential both in India and in Russia. Prime Minister's visit to Vladivostok in September was highlighted the potential that is there. India looked at Russian Far East as a separate analytical model for development. We've promised $1 billion of soft credit loans to look at potential for our cooperation in that area. But not just in the Russian Far East, but elsewhere as well. Number 2, I think we need to look at integration processes. Russia is deeply interested in the Greater Eurasian Partnership. I think India needs to pay more attention to Russian priorities here, just as Russia should pay a deeper analytical interest in the larger integration processes that India has been suggesting, primarily centered around the Indo-Pacific. My sense is that these conversations are progressing. They are poised to take off in the near future, primarily given the fact that both countries are seeing the potential for their own benefit. Russia in the Indo-Pacific and India in the Greater Eurasian Partnership area. There are several ways of doing it. The Prime Minister's visit to Vladivostok last year set forth a new connectivity in addition to north-south connectivity. We are also looking at the Chennai-Vladivostok connectivity. Given that we are, of course, poised to look at the new instruments, we need a new bilateral investment treaty, a treaty on services, which is now becoming more and more important. We have already agreed on a green corridor, and of course, India's free trade agreement with the Greater EU is something that we need to progress. Fourthly, among the new instruments, both India and Russia are global conversationalists, in a sense that there are very few areas in the world where Russia does not figure, or for that matter, India is also a contributor to the conversation. But these global issues should become part of the bilateral dialogue between India and Russia. So we need to mainstream global conversations in our bilateral issues than ever before. As we speak, the arms control architecture is going to be built bottom up. India and Russia should cooperate and not miss out the opportunities that we had to cooperate in the 1960s, when the NPT-centric world was created, when India and Russia were on the opposite sides of the table. I think this is an opportunity where we can move forward. Similarly, on maritime security, just as India should take more interest in the continental aspects of connectivity, Russia should take more interest in the maritime domain. It doesn't come easily to both countries. I think a little effort will definitely help matters. And given the trust between India and Russia, I think these conversations are very important. Similarly, on larger global challenges, I will mention climate change as one, but there are several others. The COVID pandemic has raised several other dimensions of global governance, which are under great stress. But India and Russia, given their unique conversational capabilities, can add to the conversations, irrespective of the platform, whether it's in the SEO, in the BRICS, in the G20, or in the WHO, or the UN. India and Russia should deepen their cooperation at the United Nations. This is an old area of cooperation which has fallen into disuse over the last few years, but I think India's presence on the Security Council as a non-permanent member between 21 and 22 will offer new opportunities for cooperation. Let me conclude by saying that, of course, we are all witnessing a reconfiguration of alignments. This is but natural, given the forces at play. I think we should embrace these trends of reconfiguration of alignments. It will in fact be the fulcrum around which all other alignments will take place. So with that confidence of a bilateral ambassador looking after a very successful relationship, let me hand it over back to you, Dmitri. Thank you.
Well, Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for this very comprehensive and yet succinct overview of the relationship and your forward-looking ideas about ways of re-energizing the relationship, relaunching the relationship, looking to new horizons in the relationship, and also coming up with ways and means, new ways and means of doing things. This is precisely what we need, and this is precisely what we want to get out of this conversation. Thank you very much, sir. As I said, this dialogue was inspired very much by our conversations with Ambassador Varma. But as many of you know, Carnegie is a global institution. It has a center in India, in New Delhi, as well as a center in Moscow. So we are supported in our effort today by our colleagues at Carnegie India. And Carnegie India is participating in this dialogue. A senior advisor to Carnegie India, Rajesh Bansal, will be joining the discussion on the issues of technological cooperation and other new areas of cooperation. Other participants will include Timofey Borisov, who is a research fellow with the Center of Analysis of Strategies and Technologies in Moscow. Dr. Kapoor, who is a fellow at the Observer Research Foundation, a premier think tank in India. Dr. Kulik, Lydia Kulik, head of India Studies at the Institute for Emerging Market Studies at Skolkovo, Moscow School of Management. We also have the president of the Observer Research Foundation, Dr. Samir Saran, and the distinguished fellow of the foundation, Nandan Unikrishnan. I will turn the floor over to Dr. Saran at this point to ask him to talk about the geopolitics of the relationship, the political side of the relationship, what can be, should be done to make that relationship more effective at that level. Some of the ideas have already been put forth by Ambassador Varma, but I'm sure that Dr. Saran has a lot of things to share with us. Please, Samir.
Thank you, Dr. Trenin, and very good afternoon to Ambassador Varma. And it's good to see you, sir. Although at this time through the digital medium, also great to be back with friends, Rudra, Professor Borisov, Sasha. And when I speak at a Russian roundtable, I feel at home. So I'm going to be informal in some of what I have to say. I'm going to take the liberty of sharing some ideas by way of my intervention, and hopefully Nandan can cover up for all the mistakes I make when he comes to speak later. So I have 4 thoughts. I think the first, of course, is that we can't ignore this moment. This moment is going to shape lots of our thinking, lots of our trajectories, lots of our relationships going ahead. And this COVID moment or this pandemic moment has told us a few stories that we must keep in mind. The first story, and certainly true for me, that since I have engaged with world politics, I've never seen a global crisis in which America was missing, was absent. And this is one of those moments. And American leadership, an absence of American leadership during a global event. Also, alongside that story, there's a second story. The incumbent, who was supposed to be the heir apparent, has in fact been in some ways implicated by this pandemic. So you have the G1, which is absent, and the G2, which is implicated. So the ideas that we would be in a G2 world or a G1, G2 world, I think those have all been, in some sense, been torn asunder by what is unfolded. Neither the G1 nor the G2, and I'm not describing who the G1 and G2 is, because they both may claim to be either. But I think we are more likely to be in a world which is Ian Bremmer's G0 world. I don't think we have any overwhelming global actor which can deliver public goods and punish bad actors. So I think we are in a world which now requires a reconfiguration, and that's my first story. The pandemic tells us of a world that requires rewiring, reconfiguration, new alliances, new arrangements, and that is going to be a long process. But in the interim, some small practical coalitions will be required. And certainly India and Russia are invested enough in the world order to be important actors in shaping the interim bridges that will take us to a final resting place, probably in the next decade or so. So I think the first story is a story where India and Russia and other countries will have to be less reluctant in assuming the leadership that this pandemic demands of them. I think the Russians, in my next book, which is on Russia actually, I argue that President Putin is the last grandmaster who understands geopolitics and the geography and the political geography better than anyone else. And I believe that there is still huge room for Russia to shape the future of the world, which is torn by this pandemic. And I'm, as Ambassador Verma mentioned, I think in India, you will find a permanent friend. You will also find your strategic depth. And this is the second story that I want to, and now I want to move to the second story. The second story also tells you about the failure of global institutions. And this is something, again, which has been a long-standing Russian project to reform global institutions. In fact, the whole idea of the BRICS, the SCO, was to add heft to the institutional architecture of the world. And we have seen that this pandemic has shown the frailty and vulnerability, and failure of globalization and global governance networks that were built in the previous century. this is a moment to invest in either radically reforming existing institutions or working with partners and creating new institutions. And that is also a project which I think compels India and Russia to work together due to the ease of the grammar and vocabulary that we share around how we want the world to be designed. I think in more ways than one, we have a similar vision for a global arrangement. And while we can disagree on some of the minor issues, the major directional thrust remains pretty attuned. The third story of the pandemic is the story of the rather exceptional nature of sovereigns that we have witnessed around the world. I think the idea that global value chains will serve global community has been also undermined. We have seen how the mad rush for face masks, for ventilators, for drugs, for every critical supply created a Darwin's world, a Darwinian world where every nation, every community was fending for itself. The whole idea that we would have this market-based framework that would save the world and create value for all through some miraculous ethics that the markets would bring to the fore has been challenged by this pandemic. And a new form of value chains and a new form of globalization is likely to emerge. New commerce based on technology, based on new ethics, based on new principles, but most importantly, based on political trust is going to emerge. I think the economic model of the previous version of globalization has hit a political wall. The future version of globalization will be underwritten by political trust. And I think eventually countries that trust each other will integrate more deeply with than with countries who there is a certain political mistrust with. And again, in this new model of globalization and creation of new value chains, the implicit trust between Russia and India will be a big factor in the deepening of relationships. So these are the three big stories, but let me come to three practical, immediate realities. The first, of course, is that beyond the pandemic, how will the current confrontation with China in the Himalayas change Indian foreign policy and India's approach to Russia? I think that's one thing that many would be wondering in Moscow, that what does the face-off do to our bilateral relationship, to the Indian-US relationship, to the India-Russia relationship. And my sense is that the face-off in the Himalayas is part of a bigger trend that is visible in Asia. It is Russia conducting its own Confucian version of the Monroe Doctrine. It is trying to push America out of its neighborhood. It is trying to clear the debris from its immediate proximity, and it is challenging and ensuring that each individual country in that part of the world sees China as its principal relationship. I think that is the larger trend that is visible. I think to stop it, I have a intuition and also an assessment based on what has been happening over the last 10 years. India will have far greater elbow room in this part of the world, even as it manages its relationship with the US, to create very specific, strong strategic partnerships in Eurasia. And I think Russia, the end of India-Russia defense partnership or the weakening of its strategic relationship with Russia is greatly exaggerated. In the next 5 to 7 years, I in fact see an acceleration, both in terms of defense partnerships and political coordination between Russia and India for two reasons. One, I think Russia is at some point in the near future, between now and a couple of years, going to realize that for its own engagement with China, it needs strategic depth, both in terms of its economic options and in terms of its political coordinations. And India offers that strategic depth to the Russians. India has already reached that conclusion. I think India understands that to have a stable, durable, sustainable relationship with China, I think those are the best words I can put at this time on the table for our relationship with China. But to have a sensible relationship with China, we need a strong partnership with Russia. And I think none of us want to be dismissive of the Chinese. None of us want to not benefit from a prosperous Asian region. None of us want to be, in any way undermine the prosperity and progress that is possible by cooperation. And to make that happen, I think we need a political basis which will require a strong India-Russia coordination to manage an Asian continent, which is going to be dominated by the Chinese over the next decade before others catch up. On the US-Russia relationship, I think that's another thing that's of particular interest to me. I believe we have lost 4 years in the White House. Well, that is my assessment. Hopefully, come 2020, we will have a president back again, and we will have some form of rational communication and developments, political developments coming out of that particular city. But I do believe that one of the most important elements of stability in the next decade will be how the US-Russia relationship evolves. I think at some point, policymakers in DC have to understand that a strong, stable, prosperous, integrated Russia is absolutely crucial for the Asian century. Now, I am one of those who believes India should be playing a role to make this happen. Indians are more reluctant, and the Indian establishment is more reluctant and more averse to playing any such role. But I truly believe that in India's own interest, in USA's own interest, and of course in the Russian interest, integrated and a prosperous Russia must be one of the key deliverables for the next decade. And when I say prosperous Russia, I am not trying to allude to its military might, which is unmatchable. I am talking about its $1.3 trillion GDP that needs to start punching along with its military weight. So I think the Russians need to grow their economic clout, and we need to find ways to integrate Russian economic clout. And on that, and this is my final intervention, I think 3 areas are extremely crucial. One, I think the work from home and the pandemic gives us an opportunity to escape geography. I think the traditional distances, traditional migration questions, visa issues are all redundant in the future. I think you can have an Indian workforce serving Russian needs sitting in an Indian village. I don't think you need to send thousands and thousands and millions of Indians into Russia to make up for your manpower deficit or for your human resource requirements. There are future possibilities that skilling platforms, services platforms, and professional platforms will be digital in nature and will be able to cater to various geographies from remote locations. So I think there is a huge human resource potential that the ambassador referred to. And I think the digital magnifies the possibility by the remote work reality that has in some sense become the normal. So that's one, the human resource and skills and education. The second is technology. I think we are in an uncertain era. The pandemic tells us that we are all suffering from fake news, that the digital lives are implicating real world issues. Nations and actors are beginning to use digital tools to interfere. We will need to create a whole architecture, governance system around the digital. The Russians, in their previous avatar as the Soviet Union, built up the strategic architecture that pretty much kept the world stable for 7 decades. The Russians in the future will have to also invest into building a digital world framework or governance framework, where again, I think India and Russia have a huge potential. We are already partnering on this in a number of fora. We see the world very similarly here again. We do believe in the role of the state, and we do see sovereignty as important to both of us. So I think digital architecture, digital Westphalian arrangement of the future is again something that we both can partner on. And finally, I think with the agriculture and land-based resources, there is a huge potential beyond energy and defense. So for me, I think the next 5 to 7 years are extremely rich in potential, as the ambassador mentioned. And I see digital land resources and global governance partnerships as being crucial to our common future and our region that we live in. Thank you very much, Dr. Trenin.
Thank you very much, Samir. That was brilliant. Thank you very, very much. That's a huge contribution alongside with the ambassador's remarks. Great start to the discussion today. Thank you very, very much. Can I now give the floor to your colleague, Nandan Unikrishnan? Nandan is well known to nearly everyone who deals with India in Russia. He is a dear friend, and I'm so glad that he accepted joining this dialogue at an early stage. Nandan, the floor is yours. But you have 7 minutes, Nandan. No more privileges.
Thank you, Dmitri. I am indeed honored to be here. And 7 minutes, in fact, may turn out to be a bit too much, because after these two interventions or presentations by the ambassador and by Dr. Saran, I think there is very little that is left to explain about the Indian position or the Indian view of the Indo-Russian relationship. However, there are, both of them have spoken in tremendously positive tones about the relationship, and therefore that gives me the opportunity to look at it slightly differently. I don't need to talk about the global situation. I can try and connect the global situation to the bilateral relationship. Let me take off from where the ambassador started, and Samir also mentioned this concept of trust, the trust that exists between India and Russia. Undoubtedly, there is a huge level of trust. However, let me start by saying that that trust has partially eroded. That the trust is there is signified by the fact that when India inaugurated or let into the waters, as it were, its first nuclear submarine, there was one foreigner present, and that foreigner was the ambassador of Russia in India. Now, that is clearly an indication that India was willing to acknowledge the role that Russia played in a strategic program that India was developing, and that it also showed that Russia was willing to help India, and in an area which would have required a huge amount of trust between the two countries. However, having seen that tremendous cooperation between the two in a strategic area, a recent statement by President Putin at the Valdai Club, when he said that Russia is helping China build a missile defense system, also reflects a growing level of trust. And given India's relationship with China and India's attitude to China, obviously this raised some questions in the Indian mind. There is, of course, the larger question to a majority of Indians, but something that really doesn't worry me is Russia's growing relationship with Pakistan. But I would focus on something else. I would focus on some areas in which I think we still see daylight between the Indian perception on Afghanistan and the Russian perception of what is to happen in Afghanistan. So now, once I've identified, I'm not trying to say that the ambassador and Samir are incorrect. In fact, I'm grateful for them for drawing on the positive ground on which this relationship stands, because I can show up some of these wrinkles and probably also get them addressed in the process of discussions. So, in the context of the growing world order change that is coming up, and which was so eloquently and succinctly put by Samir, I think it is important for us to recognize that the relationship between India and Russia at the political strategic level also has a tremendous potential, but there are some wrinkles that have crept in the last couple of decades, and these need to be seriously addressed. Now, coming back to the issue of re-energizing our relationship, I think I would tend to agree that we need not look at our ties in the economic sense in the old-fashioned way. I think we need to reimagine those ties. We need to look at high technology ways of re-engaging with each other. Of course, that is not going to happen tomorrow, and there are still many areas down on the ground that we could exchange. Agro industries, as the ambassador pointed out. Migration, yes, I think migration still will play a significant role, at least for the coming decade, even as high technology comes across. But even in the high technology area, there is something that I would like to flag for future discussion. You have a set of new technologies coming in, particularly 5G, which are not just about hardware. 5G in itself is a universe of its own. So the choices India and Russia make in the area of technology will also, in some ways, determine the levels of their cooperation in this area. And finally, before my 7 minutes is out, finally, I'd like to point out that at the international level, I think Samir again said this very eloquently, that there is a level of distrust in the world. There is a level of distrust in international institutions. They are not performing the role that was expected of them, and there is a need to revitalize them, if not restructure them. And I think there are certain areas in which we could work together and start probably institution building. One is, of course, arms control, as mentioned by the ambassador. The other is the digital arena, as mentioned by Samir. Undoubtedly, we should be looking at pandemics. I don't think COVID is the last one. I think with the relationship between man and nature has reached a stage where there are many unexpected events likely to occur. And finally, I will not leave aside one scourge which unfortunately exists in our world, and that is terrorism. I think that is another area in which we have tremendous scope to cooperate. And with that, my 7 minutes are over.
Nandan, thank you so much. You're a darling, really, for keeping to the time limit so well. Thank you very much. I really appreciate what you said, and I think this chimes in and expands on what the ambassador and Samir Saran have been talking about. Let me offer a few remarks on the geopolitical and security dimension of the relationship, and I will also try to be succinct in my remarks. We all live in the era, and this is something I would add to what Samir has said. Besides the changes that he has enumerated, there's one major geopolitical development that I think affects us all, and that's the emerging Sino-American bipolarity. And as I said, the rivalry between the United States and China having passed the point where it becomes confrontation. This is, I think, a momentous development in international relations. At this point, you're dealing with bipolarity without two blocks that are opposing each other. And I very much hope that the other players in the international system, particularly bigger players like India, Russia, Japan, clearly the European Union, would find the way to stay away from the US-China confrontation. That, I think, is absolutely critical for the future of the world order. Otherwise, we are going down a pretty slippery slope that is reminiscent of the Cold War. I hope we will not go that way. For Russia, and I think for India, the clear imperative under these circumstances is to keep its geopolitical equilibrium vis-a-vis your partners, also vis-a-vis your opponents, adversaries, and that, I think, is a task that certainly Russia is facing in order to keep its equilibrium in this world marked by the increasingly contentious relationship between the two new superpowers. Russia should look for upgrading relationships with other important players in Greater Eurasia. And India, alongside Europe and Japan, is one of such players. So I will make that point. And I think that there is something like that on the Indian side as well. I agree with many things that that Samir and the ambassador and you, Nandan, have been saying recently. So let me just add a couple of disjointed remarks. For Russians, I think it's important to see India as something else than a battlefield for influence between Russia and the United States. That I think is very important. You know, we're not in the Cold War framework anymore. These relationships do not mean what they used to mean in the 70s and the 80s. So Russia should be calm about India's cooperation with the United States. It should focus on its own cooperation with India. India will always be its own man. India will not submit to any other power in this world, and that I think is key to understand. And India's participation in Quad, if anything, should stimulate Russia to increase and deepen the nature and increase the level of its cooperation with India. I think that all that India and China are certainly competitors, but it's and rivals in many ways. But it's in the interest of both India and China not to become adversaries, and God forbid not to become enemies. And I think there's a role to play for Russia, clearly not as a mediator. Neither India nor China needs a mediator, but facilitation of better understanding of where each side is coming from. Sometimes when you look at the situation from the outside, you see that better understanding would prevent things from deteriorating beyond the point where either side wants it to go. And I think there's a lot can be said about Rick, this Russia, India, China format. And lastly, let me say that Russia has traditionally been, and this is something that has already been mentioned by Ambassador Varma, Russia has been traditionally a continental power. Its geopolitics is couched in continental terms. In land, it's about land geopolitics. India, of course, is a great power, which a continent-sized power or subcontinent-sized power. But at the same time, it's a maritime power. Its thinking is very much conditioned by the long coastline, the ocean that's named after India, and all these things. So there is clearly an opportunity for Russia to think about linking its, or rather expanding its geopolitical thinking to include a major maritime component. And Russia should do better than simply ignoring India's Indo-Pacific strategy, Indo-Pacific thinking. Rather, it needs to come up with maritime thinking of its own that stretches all the way to the Indian Ocean, across the Pacific. So something that would complement Russian Greater Eurasia thinking, which is essentially continental, by providing a belt, a maritime belt thinking from, let's say, Murmansk to Mumbai. That would be something that can also become a point of discussion between Indian and Russian experts and thinkers. And the thing I will say last would be that the objective should be to raise the Indo-Russia relationship today in terms of the volume of interaction, not the trust. The trust, I think, is superior to that exists between China and Russia today, but the volume needs to be expanded and the depth of interaction needs to be expanded so that India is seen by the Russians the way that China is seen today, i.e. not an Asian power somewhere out there, but as a global power, a major global power and a partner. For India, I think there are even better prerequisites from the, let's say, emotional and from the emotional standpoint, from the standpoint of the trust that exists, non-problematic relationship throughout, to raise the relationship to that level, so that a conversation about Indo-Russia relations is not a regional issue anymore. It is a global issue. India and Russia, just like Russia and China, Russia and America, Russia and Europe, those are global topics, not just regional dimensions of Russian foreign policy. Let me stop here. I hope I haven't run beyond the time allotted to all the speakers, and give the floor to Dr. Kapoor, who will start a discussion of economic opportunities, economic possibilities within the relationship. Nivedita, please.
Thank you, Dr. Trenin. It's an honor to be here, and good afternoon, everyone. So the speakers have already spoken about how the Indo-Russia relationship is one of deep trust, and it's a time-tested relationship, and the defense and the energy sector are doing very well. But this bonhomie has somehow not translated into good economic relations between the two countries. So what I'll try and do is do a quick recap of where we stand at the moment, and then I'll look at what are the impediments to this relationship, and what are some of the steps that have been suggested that can be used to improve the conditions. So in 2018, the bilateral trade touched $11 billion. And the aim in the 2019 bilateral summit was to increase it to $30 billion by 2025. So trade analysts were already noting this target to be very high, tripling of the bilateral trade when our relations have stagnated around $10 to $11 billion for a few years now. And now with the oncoming recession, this target looks even more unlikely to be achieved. So what needs to be done at this stage is to address the various issues, small, some of them might seem small, but they've had a very long-term impact on the bilateral relationship. So as I go along, I'll keep highlighting these problems in the economic relationship that need to be addressed. So the main issues that have contributed to the weakness is the lack of connectivity, the distances are long, there is the issue of non-involvement of the private sector in the economic ties, and there are also a lot of other non-tariff barriers that have affected the bilateral economic relationship. The good thing has been that both sides have acknowledged that they need to do something about it. The 2018 Sochi informal summit, which came just 4 months ahead of the annual bilateral summit, was a sign that both the sides understood that they needed to revive this relationship. And it is through this informal summit, we saw several economic measures being announced. The strategic economic dialogue was set up, which has identified focus areas for the cooperation. At the same time, India was invited to invest in Russian Far East, which resulted in the Prime Minister going to Vladivostok in 2019 as the chief guest of the Eastern Economic Forum. Even here, 6 priority areas have been identified in areas ranging from diamond to mining to oil and natural gas to tourism, so as to promote the bilateral relationship. At the same time, we are looking, especially in the energy sector, earlier we were focused on investments, investing in each other's oil and gas sector. Now India is looking at importing oil and gas from Russia, but this is a fairly recent development. In 2018, we received the first shipment of LNG from Russia. Currently, we are negotiating a long-term oil supply contract, so it still remains to be seen as to what is the volume of oil and gas that we're looking to import. And here I would also like to point out that the imports of especially gas, because India wants to increase its the share of LNG in its energy market to 15% by 2030. Now here, economists have noted that for that to happen, India will have to grow in double digits. So it's also, so the Indo-Russia economic relationship is a story both of domestic economic development by both India and Russia, as well as into the bilateral relationship. The same issue will come in the case of the Russian Far East, because for India, Indian businessmen, the Russian Far East is a very new area. So if you talk to people here, they'll tell you very cautiously that we're trying to introduce our businessmen to this region, and we hope that they will take they'll invest, they'll take this relationship forward. But for that to happen, the local economic development of the Russian Far East needs to be sped up. The issues that are involved in the Russian Far East have been discussed in detail in terms of the lack of infrastructure, the high costs involved, the labor shortages. These are some of the factors that have resulted in the Russian Far East not attracting a lot of investment despite significant efforts from the Russian government. So unless the Russian Far East also develops, it will be very difficult for them to attract Indian businesses to that region. So that is something that the domestic issues that have to be resolved. India has announced a $1 billion line of credit, but as far as we understand, both the sides are still working on the modalities of this agreement, and we are yet to see the companies take up this issue. So until we have more data points, we will be hard pressed to understand as to how is this line of credit being used. So that is something for the future. Then I'll come to what are some of the other issues. So in terms of the INSTC, the connectivity has been a major issue in terms of our trade relations not developing. And INSTC has been criticized rather frequently because in the past few years, the amount of trade that is supposed to be done through it has been consistently downgraded. So in 2010, we were expecting about 10 to 15 million tons per annum. Now we have downgraded it to about 5 million tons per annum. So this it's indicative of the low volumes of bilateral trade. Despite the fact that the route is supposed to be cost effective, it's supposed to be profitable, apart from the fact that it's not entirely complete, the issue of Iranian infrastructure not having been built, that issue persists. The issue of low trade volumes is a very complicated one that has not yet been addressed. So what I'm getting at is the fact that there are very specific issues involved in the economic relationship that we are yet to address. And the ambassador was talking about the Green Corridor, which has seen a lot of development, and both the sides have reiterated that we want to start this Green Corridor as soon as possible, and that has also been the demand of the Indian business people here. But as of now, till the 2019 summit, we have not seen it implemented. Some of the other issues, again, are involved the double taxation avoidance agreement, the bilateral investment treaty. So all of these issues, until they are resolved, they will keep being impediments in the way of business people in India and Russia to improve the relationship. There's again the issue of a welcome development has been the negotiations of the EU-India Free Trade Agreement. If you talk to the Indian business people, they do say that if this agreement it happens, it will help resolve several non-tariff barriers, which they have been insisting for a very long time that these non-tariff barriers create a problem in the bilateral trade relationship. So the sooner it happens, the better it will be for the bilateral relationship. The issue of rupee-ruble trade is something that the Indian business organizations have again been pushing for. They believe that rupee-ruble trade will improve our trade volumes. And they also, at the same time, there are certain areas that they point out, which they say the government should be focusing on. These relate to startup innovation, and not just in the tech sector. They're also looking at, not in the IT sector, just that, but also biotech, nanotech, medical, and meteorological technologies. These are some of the areas that the business people believe there's a lot of potential. At the same time, there's an idea of the fact that the small and medium enterprises, they need to form the backbone of this relationship. Because we've seen a lot of government-to-government contact, which has been pretty prevalent in the Indo-Russia case. But it is the relationship at the lower level, at the private businesses, small and medium enterprises that have not really worked out till now. And the business organizations believe that till that happens, it's going to be very difficult to build a solid base for this bilateral relationship. And there's also an insistence of the fact that we need concrete proposals to come out. Because even the 2019 summit, a lot of MOUs have been signed, but we still do not know if those MOUs will be translated into actual projects on the ground. So till we see concrete projects being established on the ground, it is going to be a little difficult to assess as to how quickly this bilateral relationship would go. Also a point on the Chennai-Vladivostok corridor, because analysts have understood that this is not just an economic project, it's also a strategic project. And the strategic gains are very obvious. But in terms of the economic gains, we are waiting for a feasibility study. The working groups have been meeting. So till a feasibility study is done, neither side would be able to say as to what is the economic viability of the project. When I was conducting a few interviews here, and I asked about what is the volume of trade that we're expecting from the Russian Far East, the benefit that will accrue. Neither the Indian side nor the Russian side at present is willing to put a number on it. They are both waiting for the results of a feasibility study. And especially if we look at the eastern side, if we're looking at the idea of LNG imports or crude oil imports, India will have to not just look at its domestic economic development to be able to absorb that oil and gas. On the eastern front, we will also have to look at the establishment of oil refineries, which will be able to cater to the Russian crude, because those refineries still now cater to the Middle Eastern crude, and the regasification terminals. So what I wanted to do through this presentation, point out the nitty-gritties of the issues that are involved, and so that once the global economy gets back on its feet, and 5 years down the line, we should not be back here talking about the same issues, business issues, that have created a hurdle in the bilateral relationship, because none of these issues are new. They have persisted for some time. The businesses have been asking for a resolution of these issues. So while the big ticket announcements do help a lot, these smaller technical issues, if resolved, they would help greatly in the improvement of the bilateral economic relationship. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Kapoor. And now for the Russian perspective or a Russian perspective on the relationship, I invite Dr. Kulik, Lydia Kulik, to give her view and share her expertise with us. Lydia, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope everybody can hear me well. I would like to start by, first of all, thanking for this opportunity to address this esteemed audience, and a vote of thanks for the Carnegie Center and personally for Mr. Trenin for organizing this event. And I would like also to thank His Excellency Ambassador Varma for his continuous support to initiatives like this, and for his support for the dialogue between Russia and India, which cannot be underestimated, of course. After Dr. Kapoor's very extensive and detailed speech about the Russian-Indian economic relations, it's very difficult to add any more, details. And I also welcome the fact that Nivedita has been rather, critical and realistic about the Russian-Indian economic relations, but I would like to take this opportunity and to call everyone to brainstorm a little bit and to look beyond the immediate horizon of economic ties between Russia and India, and to assess the current opportunities. On one hand, we see that the current crisis is putting even greater difficulty and challenge on the well-known target of increasing Russian-Indian trade to $30 billion. Because both countries at this moment are speaking more and more about self-reliance and developing their own capabilities. But at the same time, I want to stress the fact that this crisis offers new opportunities. For instance, it is obvious to everyone that it has shown the importance of digitalization. And both countries, India and Russia, place information technologies as their area of priority. On the other hand, the new opportunities may come from the fact that supply chains will be redrawn, and we may, as it was rightly said by the previous speakers, we may not rely that much on supply chains at all, because distances will shrink even further in the world of the future. Let me go back to a few years from now and mention that a few years ago, Niti Aayog from the Indian side and Center for Strategic Research from the Russian side were tasked with the need to identify the bottlenecks and the obstacles to development of Russian-Indian trade. And several years were spent in very intensive dialogue, and the governmental bodies on both sides have pinpointed the important bottlenecks and the difficulties that are at the moment, as we speak, trying to be untwined and removed. And this governmental support to Russian-Indian trade and investment is very important. We should not underestimate this. The fact that many governmental bodies from the Russian side and important governmental institutions from the Indian side are all tasked with their need to, remove obstacles to Russian and Indian trade. Of course, from the Russian side, the agencies that are involved in this important work are the Ministry of Industry and Trade, the Agency for Promotion of Investment in the Far East. Then there is Ministry of Economic Development and a number of other institutions. From the Indian side, we all know that there is a special desk at Invest India agency dedicated just to helping Russian business that wants to come to India. Then again, there is Niti Aayog that does very important work in strategic planning in many areas, including the Russian-Indian trade and investment. And the fact why I'm repeating this is because in countries like Russia and India, we should not underestimate the importance of political goodwill. And we have to stress the fact that the goodwill is there, and it is a well-known fact. When President Putin and Prime Minister Modi speak, everyone listens, and the vertical of power actually focuses their attention on economic and business issues. It was mentioned that the moment Prime Minister Modi came to Vladivostok and proclaimed the new slogan of Act Far East, that came in the place of Act East, everybody in India actually pointed and pinpointed this vast area on the map that is the Russian Far East, which is 3 times the size of India, and paid attention to the opportunities that this area presents. And if we're talking about Far East, of course, this is one of the important areas of future Russian-Indian cooperation. A lot of effort is being given at this moment to developing links between India and the Far East. As it was mentioned, of course, the connectivity has to be in place, and more Indian business has to come and see the opportunities that are present in the Far East. I have to note that Far East mainly presents the opportunities in the sectors like natural resources, agriculture, tourism, and these are, although very important sectors, they are the traditional sectors where Russia and India have been developing ties for many years already. Energy is very important, of course, and has always been. And in this regard, I want to draw your attention to the fact that a new say has to be said if we want to promote Russian and Indian business forward. As one of the hats that I'm wearing is the hat of the representative of the Moscow School of Management, Skolkovo, which is the largest private and probably the most well-known private business school in Russia. To draw your attention to the fact that while we have this political will at the top of the pyramid, for many years have missed the opportunity of building bottom-up initiatives, education, which is at the moment meeting the Skolkovo School with its India, be it educational institutions, government bodies, corporates, is trying to fill in this missing link. For instance, we cater for corporate needs of individual sectors, of industries, when it comes to real business knowledge, doing business in Russia and in India. In this work that I find very important. We have full support and great helping hand from both the embassies of Indian embassy in Russia and Russian embassy in India. And unfortunately, at this moment, we don't have physical programs of bringing Russian executives to India and Indian executives to Russia. We're trying to do as much online work as possible. But before the pandemics, we had several successful programs running, and they were greeted with a lot of interest, both on the Indian side and on the Russian side. This actual link of bringing, business connections between companies and serving the needs of actual entrepreneurs and corporates is very important. As we cannot travel that much at this moment, our school wants to focus more on important research, and please stay tuned for some interesting research reports that will be released by Skolkovo School in the near future that will cover the trends in Indian business and generally, the changing nature of entrepreneurship in India, which as I believe Russian audience have to be educated about, because for many years, unfortunately, there has been a missing opportunity and a missing link in terms of research, in terms of information about what is going on in India. One of such events that I wanted to highlight is the very rapid digitalization of Indian economy. The booming entrepreneurial sphere in India at the moment, as we speak, I think there are about 30 unicorns in India, and there are already a few Russian venture capital investors who have been investing in the Indian sector. And as we see IT being the priority for Russia too, we should not see this as a competing sphere, but we should focus on the synergies. And for instance, India could be a launching pad for the Russian companies and for the Russian knowledge to go global. While we may face restrictions, in all other areas, India could serve as a great partner towards, work aimed at third countries. And as other speakers have already mentioned, there are other areas of beyond the horizon, I would say, but the future is now, so it is not too far from this moment as we speak. Areas, be it artificial intelligence, financial technology, which would be very important, for releasing the deadlocks of payments between Russia and India. Also, cybersecurity, that was already mentioned by some speakers, could be a great area of cooperation between Russia and India. We all at the school, and I speak to the Russian entrepreneurs looking at India, say that when you come with some proposals to your partners or to the Indian market, these proposals should always aim at solving the problems that India is facing at the moment. And we also see that it is quite important to offer not just products but services to the Indian market. They find their way with the customers easier than products. I want to highlight the area which is skilling and education, which is important for India. Renewable energy is another area where we can cooperate. Logistics and transport, where digitalization is going to play a crucial role in the future. These are some of the areas where Russia and India has to look close at cooperating with each other. And I'm sure this is this work is very slow, of course, but as we move on and we don't give up, step by step, we'll of course unlock all these opportunities, which I'm very optimistic about.
Well, Lydia, thank you very much. There's a wealth of ideas that you shared with us. I think there's a way forward in so many directions. Thank you for sharing that with us. This is really great. Now we come to technology. Lydia already started talking about that. And I give the floor to my colleague at Carnegie India, Rajesh Bansal, who is the senior advisor to our sister center in New Delhi. Rajesh, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dmitri. I hope I am audible. Thanks for
absolutely,
giving me this. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to speak at this webinar. Ambassador Verma and my other esteemed colleagues, it's great to be discussing Indo-Russian partnership. And if everybody is okay, I would definitely want to start on a personal anecdote when it comes to Indo-Russia. So when Dmitri invited, I will tell you what went through my mind. The first images I remember was when I was in school. I was maybe in 8th grade or something, where you remember the Rakesh Sharma, India's first man into space in 1984. I remember my black and white TV, the image where the then Prime Minister of India, Indira Gandhi, was talking to him. And that is what, I remember as a child, what is India-Russia partnership, and remember how it was possible because of that partnership, which is currently playing out in the project Gaganyaan. It's scheduled for 2020. It's got a bit delayed because of the pandemic. And we all know that we've had very good relationships, including setting up, as the then Prime Minister used to call it, the temples of modern India, industrial, belts in Bokaro, Bhilai, steel plants, which have led to the industrialization in India. So there's no doubt that we have been old friends, as all of you rightly said. The current challenge, as we have seen, is that the trade is around $10 billion, and each of us rank very lowly in terms of the amount of trade we do. It is a welcome move that President Putin and Prime Minister Modi have set a target of 30 billion by 2025. The remit to me by Dmitri is to focus on technology. And Lydia, honestly, I was very glad that, from the Russia side, you brought in interesting things, and I'll resonate some of what you said. First one is to do with the ecosystem of startups. As she said, India is, one of the highest, one of the countries which has number of unicorns and are doing well in financial technologies. And I think that's a great opportunity for Russian startups and venture capital to collaborate with Indian startups, and similarly otherwise to look at what could be leverage, what are the strengths. That's one. Secondly, as we know that India is one of the largest STEM graduates in the world, and we did discuss that this can actually play, and Russia has a very vibrant R&D industry. They are one of the top 10 spenders on R&D. So combined with the human capacity and the engineers that graduate from India and the R&D vibrant ecosystem, I think that is the second important thing that I want to highlight. The third is to do with artificial intelligence. I was glad to hear that Russia has already come out with a law, a limited purpose law for implementing artificial intelligence in Moscow, and set that as an enabler. So that's something which India is currently issued. The Niti Aayog, the think tank of the government of India, has issued an artificial intelligence strategy and has set up groups which are looking at what should be done in various areas. My recommendation would be, there is a very specific, case where Russia is far ahead of India, and India has a lot of potential to learn. Especially, I'm passionate about artificial intelligence and health, and Russia is known to do well in that. So that's the second thing. You're leveraging AI in health with the fact that Russia is far ahead. Thirdly, very tangible, 3 sub-points I would like to bring up, which can happen. I spent most of my working life in the area of digital payments and digital technologies, including building India's ID system. So 3 specific things come to my mind. One is that Russia, the Bank of Russia, has established the national payment card system. It has its own, so to say, domestic card scheme, the MIR card. MIR, the Mir card. And India has its own domestic card scheme called the RuPay card scheme. Both the countries, for strategic reasons, have decided to set up their card scheme. Not many other countries have card scheme. China is another big example. And most of the world payments are run on Visa and MasterCard and American Express. So the fact that India has a RuPay card and Russia has a Mir card, if we can make them interoperable, which means somebody who's holding a Mir card comes to India, they should be able to transact in India using the Mir card rather than looking at some other international card. And similarly, and vice versa for Indian RuPay card holder. And this will not just be a bilateral interoperable system, but also a system where we could go potentially international acceptance, especially in Asia, and build on each other's strengths of domestic card system. Secondly, I would like to talk about the faster payment systems which Russia has introduced. And similarly, India has introduced faster payment systems, instant payments, in the form of unified payment interface, which is doing pretty well. I think that's another important rail, and Lydia did allude to it. The payment rails are critical enablers for trade and commerce. So we could leverage these rails of unified payment interface and faster payment systems of Russia to enable instant, seamless money transfers, which are possible. And I don't want to talk about the plumbing that is needed here, but having been thinking about it. Third, and the last one, again, on an emerging and a frontier area, is to do with the initiative which Russia is taking in terms of launch of digital ruble. Digital rupee is still something which the Reserve Bank of India and the government of India hasn't thought about, but Russia is already contemplating a law for actively contemplating on what should be done. What should be the form and design of a digital ruble or the central bank digital currency? And I feel there is a lot of synergy because, as other speakers said, there's a lot of trust, which already exists. So building on that trust, central bank digital currency research and collaboration, and including playing an important role in global standard setting of the central bank digital currencies would be a great way forward. I'll stop here. Thank you, Dmitri.
Rajesh, thank you so much. That's very, very good. That's very useful. Let me turn the floor over to our last speaker, Timofey Borisov, who is with the Center of Analysis of the Strategies and Technologies. He will speak on the technological cooperation issues, of course, from the Russian perspective. Timofey, go ahead, please.
Yes, thank you. I think that most of the aspects of India-Russia relations have already been covered by the previous speakers, so I would like to focus more specifically on the military technical aspect, and I will try to make it briefly. It is a cliche to state that arms trade is one of the major pillars and the most fruitful part of those relations. But it is undoubtedly so, and the potential here has not yet been exhausted. At the same time, there are lots of stereotypes about it. Probably the major one, and it often appears in the newspapers headlines, is that Russia is losing or Russia has already lost the Indian market. Indeed, there was a period of stagnation between 2012 and the autumn of 2018. When no major contracts were signed. Moreover, Moscow lost several important tenders. But the global arms market is not linear, and there are different cycles of rearmament, and we know that a single year can bring a big contract that would make a change to the whole trend. And we saw that happened in October 2018, when Russia and India signed the 5 billion contract for the delivery of the S-400 air defense systems, which became the biggest contract in history of bilateral relations. Another point is that when we think in terms of Russia losing or winning the Indian market, India itself is not perceived as an independent actor, rather simply as the area where great powers compete using arms sales as an instrument to expand their influence in the region. Well, this is quite far from being true. India has deliberately pursued the policy of diversification since at least 1970s to hedge the risk of being dependent on sole supply. So there's nothing new in the current situation. Only the number of suppliers increased while their respective shares in the Indian market, and of course, including the Russian share, has decreased. The next big issue is the Indian efforts to become self-reliant in weapons production. Although New Delhi still faces the imbalance between its urgent needs caused by the ongoing military modernization in Pakistan and China, and what the national defense industry can offer. It becomes even more apparent after some undesired events occur, like the last year tensions with Pakistan or the recent border incidents with China, when the discussions to ramp up the weapons procurement from abroad start in India. But the trend is clear, and it is a matter of time for India to become less dependent on imports, and the recent pandemic has only accelerated the process. And I think that all major suppliers should take into account seriously and offer new formats of cooperation, such as the transfer of technologies, licensing, joint development and production of weapons systems. And I need to say that Russia has a good record here, and it has been doing so long before the Prime Minister Modi formulated it as the Make in India policy in 2014. Russia is one of the most open countries towards India as far as the military technology transfer is concerned. So one of the promising areas for further cooperation here could be developing some joint projects within newly organized in 2 Indian states, the so-called defense industrial corridors. There is already the Indo-Russia Rifles Company aimed at manufacturing Kalashnikov rifles for the Indian Army. And there are many more opportunities. And I think that recent changes in the Indian regulations of the foreign direct investments in the defense sector, which moved the limit from 45% to 100% under the under the automatic route, might serve a good stimulus. At the same time, we still lack information on each other, which seems quite strange, being aware of the long history of our relations. And that's especially true when it comes to the level of small and medium enterprises, private companies. And it is certainly an important issue to deal with. Another problem is the US sanctions, which have not yet been imposed on India, unlike it happened with China, for example, but it could be, and we should bear it in mind, both from the technical side, so to find alternative ways to make transactions, and to the political one, where India needs to balance between Russia and the United States without harming its own defense capabilities, which would not be an easy task. Well, I think that's probably all I wanted to state here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Timofey, for being also very good with the timing of with the time frame of your presentation. I have a few questions from the audience, so let me ask those questions, and I will ask you, the participants, the speakers, to comment on them. The Centers of Excellence, which covered more than 500 joint projects in basic and applied sciences, exist. How do you put new life into them with additional impact I'm just reading what I have here with additional impact in those exceptional institutional arrangements. So centers of excellence, how to put new life into those centers that pursue over 500 joint projects in basic and applied sciences. Is there anyone who would want to take that question? That comes from Dr. Irina Isakova. Timothy, would you be willing to do that? No. Lydia? Rajesh?
I think the ambassador wants to answer it.
Oh, the ambassador, I didn't see that.
Yeah.
Mr. Ambassador, would you want to respond to that question?
Yeah, I mean, if there was no one else taking it up, I would offer two thoughts. One is India-Russia science and technology cooperation dates back to almost 3 decades. It was one of the biggest foreign scientific cooperation projects that we had with the former Soviet Union, and it's continued in Russia. But it has an old, classical, almost bureaucratic character to it, which is cooperation on listed projects with the listed science and technology institutions in both countries. It works very well, but obviously there is a need to modernize it, to make it more open-ended, to bring in private enterprise, private research, and we've made a good beginning in that. I think the increasing engagement with Skolkovo is a good example. We have now focused on young scientists using the Sirius Center in Sochi. That's another example. We have some more ideas in mind, and I think when President Putin visits India later this year, we intend to look at that. But the basic point is that science and technology is a very important pillar. It's an old pillar, but we need to modernize it, and I think there's interest on both sides to do so. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. There's a question about India's non-permanent membership in the UN Security Council in 21 and 22. Any chance, the question is, any chance to use India's presence for further cooperation in reforming this institution? Let me just respond briefly from a Russian perspective. The issue of reforming the United Nations is a long-standing issue, and it doesn't look like it's going to be resolved anytime soon. But the very serious developments that are happening in the world, and Dr. Saran mentioned some of the key trends in the world. These things are changing the international system, and clearly these changes would have at some point an impact on the global institution, universal institutions such as the United Nations, including its Security Council. Russia's position on India's membership, potential membership in the UN Security Council is well known. It's been a long-standing Russian position that India needs to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council. There are countries such as China that object to that. I think that the Indian presence in the Council gives Russia and India a great opportunity to collaborate even more closely on global issues, just as was said during this discussion today. This is where the global issues cooperation between Delhi and Moscow can rise to a new level, and from there it could be expanded and developed and turned into a global factor, Indo-Russian collaboration on major global issues, including at the United Nations Security Council, but also going way beyond that. So that's my view. If the ambassador or somebody wants to comment on that question, you're most welcome. If not, I will read the next question. The next question comes from one of the speakers, actually from Nandan. Would rupee and mere interoperability be sanction-proof? Who would take that question? Rajesh was talking about that. Maybe it's appropriate that he takes that question.
Yeah, sure, Dmitri. So I'll be honest, one disclaimer, I am not the expert on the sanction regime, but as he asked, I looked it up again. What I see is that the US sanctions on Russia are for specific entities, even in the financial sector area. Hence, my reading, again, not conclusive, is that it might not impact the mere and rupee partnership which I am proposing, but it needs closer examination. I'll stop it.
Well, thank you, Rajesh. Our next question is about Chinese investments in Russia. I think that this question would go to Lydia. The question is, Chinese investments in Russia are soon going to overwhelm Russian capacity to hold their own or avoid growing Chinese influence in Russia. So how does Russia plan to tackle this challenge of Chinese investment that, as the reader, as the listener is saying, is posing a threat to overwhelm Russian capacity to stay an independent, economically independent player? Would you care to take that question, Lydia?
Thank you. I see two tracks in the question that is raised, and probably the person who was raising this question also hinted or meant to ask a broader question, in fact. So what we see here is the obvious trend that's been obvious to everyone for decades, that there are powers that want to see China contained, and the method for containment is the clash of China with other major players such as India and Russia. And we've seen in the recent crisis again and again Russia's position to not get into this confrontation, and it is in fact in Russia's long-term interest to see stability and cooperation in the Greater Eurasia, where India and China are both keys to this process. At the same time, we cannot ignore the recent events where probably for many people in India, for instance, it's become obvious that close economic cooperation and interdependence cannot guarantee countries from political and strategic crisis, unfortunately. So in my view, I would try to, balance these two concerns and still say that economic interdependence and interconnectivity is important in preventing serious crises from happening. So the more interdependence there is, the easier it is to talk and the easier it is to mediate crisis. Definitely there are more, platforms and grounds for greater, conversation, and it needs to be in place. And this is not just for Russia and China, but this is also for India and China too. Probably I would concur with Russia's official position in this, that RIG format is important, and if we want to move things forward, we definitely need to engage all three countries in any conversation in the future, be it economy or defense or strategy. That would be my view.
Thank you very much for your answer. Let me add to that the idea that Russia is slowly turning into a vassal of China, something that's very widespread in parts of the world, is essentially wishful thinking. I see no chance, zero chance, of Russia becoming subservient to China. Russia becoming economically and then politically, geopolitically dependent on China. This is just not going to happen. Russia may deny itself some opportunities connected to closer engagement with China if Russia believes that its security, its much prized sovereignty is at stake. Russia is nothing if not a great power in the thinking of the Russian leadership. And there are limits to how close relations with other great powers can be, and that pertains to China fully. So we have a very good relationship with China, but this relationship clearly has its limits on the Russian side as well as on the Chinese side. China actually showed us meaning Russians, back in the late 1950s and the early 1960s, that it did not want to be, did not want to submit itself to Moscow's rules. And whatever you think of Mao Zedong, his policy was distancing from the Soviet Union, was aimed at preserving Chinese sovereignty vis-a-vis its former big brother. So this time, the certainly economic balance between China and Russia has changed, has reversed, and Russia is very careful about preserving its sovereignty. And by the way, Chinese investments in Russia do not constitute a huge amount of funds that were invested in this country. So let me ask another question, and this is about the scope of Indo-Russian cooperation in the Arctic. Can anyone discuss this? Maybe Mr. Ambassador, can you talk about that, sir?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. The Arctic, and especially the opening of the Northern Passage, has rekindled a new interest in India for several reasons. First is there was already considerable cooperation within the Arctic Council. India is an observer in the Arctic Council. We have good consultations with Russia on a bilateral basis on what we can do as part of the Arctic Council. We also have bilateral interaction with Russia on Arctic issues, basically starting with science and technology. But slowly it will extend into energy, because a number of the energy projects that India is interested in will have an Arctic dimension. We've also seen that many of the industrial projects, manufacturing projects that are coming up in the Far East also add to Russia's increasing economic development in the Arctic area. Lastly, there is also the issue of connectivity. Just as we see the Northern Sea Passage coming up from Yamal to Vladivostok, or from Murmansk to Vladivostok, the logical continuation of that is from Vladivostok to Chennai, or as Dmitri very eloquently put, Murmansk to Mumbai. And this will involve the Northern Sea route. And our Prime Minister very eloquently said in the Vladivostok summit last year that Vladivostok is the Sangam. Sangam is a very evocative Sanskrit word of coming together, a junction of not just in a physical sense, but a spiritual sense of the Arctic area and the maritime connectivity from Vladivostok to Chennai and to India. So we definitely see India's engagement with the Arctic as being very important. We see Russia as an important partner for us as we engage in the Arctic Council. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Before we are almost 15 minutes.
Dmitri, can I add a
overtime.
point here?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, Nandan.
Yeah, I will be the proverbial ложка дегтя, as the Russians like to say. This whole, I mean, I'll be a bit of a skeptic on the Arctic for two reasons. One is, I think at the government level, there is a lot of recognition of the importance of the Arctic, particularly at the higher levels of government, where the ability to think strategically is a bit more developed. And I would agree with the ambassador that connectivity and energy are seen as issues that would make it important for India. However, just like the INSTC, any connectivity project can only be successful if it has a volume of commerce. If you want to engage India into that volume of commerce, it is not possible without the Indian private sector. And the Indian private sector constitutes more than 80% of the Indian economy. And today, the Indian private sector is not genuinely yet involved with Russia. So I would say that while it is important to keep these projects in mind, I think what we need to concentrate on, what both countries need to concentrate on, particularly in the government sector, thinking caps are required to see how India's private sector can be enthused to get involved with Russia at a deeper level to integrate our economies. Thank you.
Well, Nandan, this is an immensely important question. I think it goes without saying that without engaging the Indian private sector, there's no brighter future for the relationship. This is precisely what we started with. The relationship was very much driven by state-supported projects, nationally supported projects, government-supported projects, but the thing is to attract the private sector, absolutely. And before we close, I have my old and esteemed colleague from Carnegie Moscow, who is currently at CIPRI in Stockholm, Peter Topichkanov, someone who combines two very important but very rare combination of fields of expertise in Russia. He is an India expert and at the same time an expert in arms control issues and wider security, global security issues. So Piotr, you have the floor and you'll be the final speaker in today's conversation.
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure for me to see everybody, and I would like to thank distinguished speakers for their excellent presentations. I have a comment, and it will be brief. The title of the event about the upgrading the strategic relations between Russia and India has weaknesses in itself, because if we have some problems in the current strategic relations, then when upgrading them further, we are under risk to keep them and even to make them bigger and more important for the bilateral relations. And one of the issues we touched at the beginning, it was about the trust. And here I would say that we need to be very precise about our language, because yes, there is a trust between political leadership of India and Russia. There is a trust between the military establishment of two countries, between big businesses of two countries. But sometimes in Russia, we are ignoring the very important actor in India, which is mass media and the public opinion. And here, unfortunately, the trust is eroding, and not because of some influences from outside of our bilateral relations, but unfortunately because of our own weaknesses. For instance, after the most recent tension between China and India in the Galwan Valley, the Russian official response, public response, was delayed, and we were puzzled about what the Russian position on it. And it is important not to deliver this message to the political leadership of China and India at that moment, but to the public opinion, to be transparent about it. Otherwise, there are the possibilities that there may be misinterpretations, wrong assessments, and even some opinions that may make the space for maneuvering for the Indian leadership shrinked because of dominating public views. So this is why important to keep these channels not only open to the public opinion in India, but very actively exploited by Russia. This is my brief comment. Thank you so much.
Piotr, thank you for your comment. It's great to see you again. Haven't seen you for a couple of years. You look great. I think you raised the two very important issues. One is public diplomacy, what governments communicate to their own publics, to the publics elsewhere. And I agree with you. It was a delicate moment for Russia, clearly. But the issue was played down in Russia very much for a variety of reasons. And I agree with you, with your point that there needs to be a much more timely response, because no response is also kind of a response. You win nothing by just withholding your voice for a period of time. You're not saying stupid things maybe, but people are wondering what you're thinking. But the second issue, I think, is even bigger, and that's the amount of time that the Indian media devote to Russia, Russian views, Russian developments, etc., and the amount of time that the Russian media devote to India. And this will be my closing parting thought even. I think that the upgrade, and I still stick with that phrase, because upgrading also means correcting the flaws, correcting the glitches, correcting the bigger issues in the relationship. That's an upgrade. To me, the upgrade means that India to Russia should not be a regional issue anymore. 20 years ago, China for Russia, and even 15, even maybe 10 years ago, China was a regional issue. It's a global issue now. India belongs, in my view, in the same category. It's a global power. It's a global great power that is growing, and it belongs in that category. Also, you have, as Russia, you have a golden opportunity of working on a relationship that rests on a pedestal that is essentially problem-free. With China, you have such a heavy baggage to carry. Both the Chinese and the Russians have a lot of hard memories about their partner. They're keeping them, putting them to one side, but it's never forgotten. India and Russia are the unique duo in the world that do not have conflicts between them as part of their collective memory. And that is something that needs to be not only preserving that's been finely done, but preserving is just less than half the job that you need to be doing. You need to upgrade, you need to build up on that. And my conclusion is that in today's world, and we discussed that world with Samir and then later, Russia needs India more than it did before. And I would say that India needs Russia almost as much, maybe more than it needed the Soviet Union at some point in its history. And this is something that we need to be working on. And the media clearly need to be involved. Think tankers need to be much more active. And this, again, getting out of the ghetto of regionalism, getting out of the ghetto of, let's say, being peripheral. I would say that for the Indian media, Russia is, I think, is kind of a peripheral country. And putting India and Russia in the center of attention would serve best the interests of both the publics in India and in Russia. Is there anything anyone wants to say? Mr. Ambassador, esteemed participants in the discussion, speakers, who would want to offer parting thoughts? This is the time you can do that. If not, I will just thank everyone and wish you a very good day. I think it's been
the ambassador wants to speak.
Ambassador, yeah.
Absolutely, Mr. Ambassador. Please, sir.
Dmitri, thank you very much. The idea for this conference, you might remember, emanated at a lunch at which I was an hour and a half late. So I would count this as the large-heartedness of our friendship, that you have taken forward this idea, and it's been an outstanding session. We thank all the participants for the very forward-looking ideas that they have been put forward. We've taken careful note of them, and we will be reaching out separately to each one of them and through Carnegie Moscow to see how we can keep these ideas alive. I very much take the idea of involving the private sector. I think that is the new blood that needs to flow in our veins. Precisely for that reason, we had $1 billion of soft credit line that was announced at the Vladivostok summit. And we're very confident that this new connectivity routes that are coming up will be used by the private sector, because finally, that is where it will come about. Your broad conclusions is something that I concur with. India and Russia need to talk more about the global conversations. We need to talk to other friends also about the common challenges that we face. You mentioned Japan, you mentioned EU, the ASEAN can be included, Central Asia. You know, there's a whole gamut of conversations that are possible. But from the embassy side, I would like to thank you, Carnegie Moscow, for organizing this, and you have encouraged us to call on your hospitality sometime in the future again for a repeat performance at some time that is convenient to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, all the speakers. Thank you, all those who watched and listened and participated in this discussion. It's certainly something that will be continued. I'm absolutely convinced that this is the way to go. Thank you all. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.